What if a 2,000-year-old sacred text was actually a blueprint for corporate strategy? It sounds wild, but today we're going to deconstruct 1 Timothy. We're looking at it not just as a religious letter, but as a really fascinating and, yeah, deeply debated historical document.
And that really gets to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? Is this thing a sacred letter? A gentle guide for a young pastor? Or is it something a lot more calculated? A manual for corporate control? That's the big question we're diving into.
Now, the analysis we're drawing from does not pull any punches. It calls this letter a harsh, foundational manual for corporate control. The argument is, this wasn't written to be some feel-good devotional. Nope, it was a strategic document designed to solve a crisis by building a rigid, publicly respectable organization. And that's our starting point.
Okay, so first things first, we have to put on our detective hats. We need to investigate the mystery at the very core of this document. Who in the world actually wrote it?
So here you see this central conflict. The letter itself claims it's from the Apostle Paul. But, and this is a big but, the overwhelming view among scholars is that it's pseudo-epigraphal. Now that's just a fancy word for a common practice back then, where a later follower would write in their teacher's name to give their words more authority. So why the doubt? Well, let's look at the clues.
Clue number 1 is the vocabulary, and this is a big one. There are nearly 300 Greek words used in this letter that you just don't find anywhere in Paul's other undisputed writings. That is a massive linguistic fingerprint pointing to a totally different author with a different style.
And then there's clue number 2. The entire focus is different. I mean, completely. Paul's undisputed letters, they're these passionate theological deep dives into things like faith and resurrection. But 1 Timothy, it's laser-focused on sound doctrine and building a church hierarchy. The priorities have clearly shifted, which suggests a different writer from a different time.
And our final clue here is the setting itself. The letter describes this church with a really defined structure. You've got clear roles for bishops and deacons, but that level of organization, it just doesn't line up with what we know about the church during Paul's actual lifetime. It really does feel like a snapshot from a later decade.
So when you put all that evidence together, the vocabulary, the different focus, the historical setting, the conclusion for most critical scholars is pretty clear. The brutally honest truth is that this letter was most likely written by a follower, decades after Paul died, who was using the apostle's name to tackle a whole new set of problems.
Okay, so if it wasn't Paul, that begs an even bigger question, right? Why was this written? What was the motive behind creating this manual for order? Let's shift from the who to the why.
The strategic purpose, it seems, was to bring order to what was a pretty chaotic early Christian movement. You've got internal threats from false teachings and external threats to their reputation. So the author designed this letter to build a respectable household of God. You could almost think of it as a PR and HR intervention for a struggling startup.
And the author laid out a two-part plan. First, a surgical attack. Go right after the false teachers and all their distracting ideas. But second, and this is so key, establish really strict public-facing qualifications for the leaders. They had to be above reproach, not just in their spiritual life, but in their family and business lives too. Suddenly, character became the #1 job requirement.
You know, what we're really seeing here is a classic organizational trade-off. It's a pattern you see all the time as movements grow and scale. That initial, charismatic, unpredictable fire gets replaced by a demand for structure and respectability. You sacrifice some of that early liberty for long-term stability. And 1 Timothy, it's a textbook example of an organization growing up and creating a rulebook to survive.
But of course, creating a rulebook like this, it had consequences. So let's turn now to its most difficult and, frankly, its most controversial legacy.
And here it is. This is the passage that has been at the center of debate for centuries. The text is very direct, and its interpretation has had a massive impact, systemically limiting the leadership roles of women in many, many Christian traditions.
So how do people even begin to make sense of this? Well, the analysis really boils it down to 3 main ways of looking at it. One view is that it's a timeless, universal command for everyone everywhere. Another is that it was a very specific command for a very specific cultural problem happening in the city of Ephesus at the time. And then there's a third view, which basically sees it as a theological stumbling block, a passage so difficult and so out of sync with other teachings that it has to be handled with extreme care.
Okay, so let's shift gears for a second. How can we take the core logic of this ancient manual, this playbook for organizational survival, and maybe apply it to our own lives?
The source material suggests we can actually see it as a blueprint for a kind of personal operating system.
We can take that same rational demand for order and turn it inward. So, first up, a doctrine of diligence. Audit your routine. Are you getting lost in distractions, or are you focused on high-return work? Second, structure for godliness. Make sure your external reputation isn't being sabotaged by internal weakness. Because, let's be real, poor integrity will always limit your influence. And third, confront your constraints. What are the self-imposed, outdated beliefs you're clinging to that are holding you back?
And that brings us to our final thought for today. The author of 1 Timothy wrote a harsh, strategic manual to surgically remove threats to their organization's future. So the question for us is this: what self-imposed limits, what outdated beliefs in your own life are you ready to surgically remove so you can get to the next level?